All right. Well, it is 7 o'clock. So, hello and welcome to our third part in the Battle of the Soul for America lecture series. My name is Sam Egan from the Puget Sound Office of Alumni and Parent Relations, and I will be your host during this virtual lecture. And before we begin, I wanted to say a quick note. Thank you to all of our participants for switching from our traditional lecture format and onto this virtual platform. It is greatly appreciated. In order to have the best view, our presenters please ask that you switch your video from the gallery view to the speaker view if you're viewing this online. This can be done by moving your mouse to the top right-hand corner and selecting your view options. I'll give you a brief moment to make that change, and I will put these instructions in the group chat as well. With that, please remain muted for the duration of the lecture. I will be standing by to take questions in a first come, first served basis based on those who send in a question or raise their hand during our Q&A section. To request to raise your hand, that option can be found in the participant tab located in the middle of the bottom bar on your screen. If at any point in time you have an immediate question, please feel free to send that to the group chat or email studentalumni@pugetsound.edu. At this time, I'd like to introduce our two speakers, Presidential Historian Mike Purdy and Pacific Lutheran Professor of Political Science, Michael Artime. And with that, thank you, and I'll leave this to you.
Thank you, Sam. Michael, we advance to the next slide. Great. So good evening, friends. It's a vast understatement to say that we're living in the midst of earth-shaking, historic, scary, and unprecedented times as a nation and as a world as we collectively struggle with the impacts of the deadly coronavirus. We're witnessing in real time the disruptive upheaval of the very foundations of society as businesses shut down, as we isolate ourselves from physical contact with others and practice social distancing, as the market gyrates in a fearful downward trend, and as our political world gets even crazier, if that is even possible after what we've experienced the last 3 years. So I'm speaking to you from my home in Seattle, and Dr. Michael Artime is joining us from his home in Tacoma. And at the hub of it all is Sam Egan, who you heard from a moment ago from the University's Office of Alumni and Parent Relations, who tonight is orchestrating all of the technical details to make this lecture happen. So thank you very much, Sam, for all you have done. So we're grateful to Sam and to others at the university, to Logan and Technical Services for figuring out a way to make this lecture work virtually. And while we would have loved to have been with you in person, of course, we do need to be safe, and thus we're doing the virtual lecture. So we hope that our time together tonight will provide some context and perspective to the constant drama that is unfolding before our eyes. And in many ways, we've really been on drama overload for a long time. Trump's election, administrative actions that are ripping at the fabric of our nation, the Mueller investigation, impeachment, which wasn't that long ago, but it seems like an eternity ago, coronavirus, and coming up, the most consequential election in the history of this nation in November that will really determine the future of our democracy. So, there's really a good reason why Michael and I decided early on not to put a title to each of the lectures when we were planning this series. Things are moving so quickly that titles would be out of date by the time the lecture was delivered. Actually, Michael and I met on March 4th at a restaurant, no less. That's when we could still do that, just a little over 2 weeks ago to plan out this lecture. But exactly a week ago, last Thursday, I was reviewing the outline that we had agreed upon, And I realized it was hopelessly out of date. Just a week after we had met, you know, a brokered convention doesn't seem like a possibility that it originally was. The case for which candidate is the most electable in November doesn't seem as relevant with the overwhelming votes that have propelled Joe Biden to a commanding lead on his way to the Democratic nomination. And we had nothing in the original March 4th outline addressing the coronavirus. So we've reshaped the lecture to hopefully be relevant to the state of affairs today. I do want to say that, and I know I speak for all of us, that our hearts go out to those who are negatively impacted by the coronavirus. For those who are sick with it, for the family of those who have passed away, for those who are socially isolated, for those who have lost their jobs or have had to close their businesses and are severely impacted financially by the loss of income, for those dealing with the challenges of managing children who are out of school. And we're so grateful for the medical professionals who are working so hard to keep us healthy, and the workers at the polling places and the primaries across the country who are ensuring fair and open elections. Next slide. So I think I know most of you. You know me, Mike Purdy, presidential historian, PresidentialHistory.com, book last June that I published, 101 Presidential Insults, What They Really Thought About Each Other and What It Means to Us. It's available on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble if you're interested. And then also joining us tonight is Dr. Michael Artime, who's the chair of the political science department at Pacific Lutheran University, where he's also an assistant professor of political science. So this lecture series is really meant to, ride this tumultuous 2020 campaign together. We've had 2 lectures before. We've got tonight, of course, virtually. We don't know, nobody does know at this point, whether we're going to be able to meet together in person on June 18th or whether that's going to be a virtual lecture as well. So we're all just waiting as things unfold, obviously. The 2 previous lectures we've done on October 24th and February 6th were both videoed and are available on my website, PresidentialHistory.com, under the Resources tab. So just a couple of logistics about tonight. We're going to talk between Michael and I between 60 and 75 minutes. We'll just see how that goes. And then we want to have plenty of time for questions. Sam explained how the questions would be handled. And when we get to the end of the lecture and get to the questions, Sam will again reiterate those instructions for us. So what are we going to talk about tonight? Well, we're going to talk about, has anything changed since we last met on February 6th? Well, a whole bunch. It is a different world. We're going to talk about how the coronavirus might affect the election. We're going to talk about how the government has responded to the coronavirus and from a technical perspective, and then we'll also look at the role of presidential moral leadership in times of crises. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time on, what could go wrong, some speculation, some conspiracies, some wonderings, and because this is a very wild world we're living in, and really anything could happen. And then we'll move to the question and answer period. So in terms of the key dates in 2020, we've been having debates, Democratic debates once a month. Now there's one scheduled coming up, but the question remains, is it really going to happen? Is Bernie Sanders going to drop out of the race or not? The conventions are in July and August. Democratic convention in Milwaukee, July 13th to 16th, and Republican convention in Charlotte, North Carolina from August 24th to the 27th. You got the debates, general election debate dates, and then of course, election day. This is what's, on the books right now. But in fact, things could change because we're living in a very unstable time right now. So Michael, tell us what has changed since we last met, if anything, or is this kind of still the same world we're living in?
Oh, pretty well the same. Can you hear me? Am I coming through? Oh, here, let's see.
Yeah,
there we go.
There's your picture. Good.
Okay, you can hear me too, right?
Yep.
All right, great. Well, before I move into that, I just wanted to say again and kind of reiterate what Mike was talking about. A reason to keep doing something like this and not to put it on hold is that it's important to find some sense of community in a time of isolation. And so I just want to echo Mike's thanks to you for joining us tonight, because the relationship that we have with you all is a reciprocal one. And so we're thankful that you've chosen to be in community with us tonight, and we're excited to be in community with you. Also, if you haven't already done so, I would encourage you to give to your local food bank or food pantry, which can be essential for families who are facing economic hardship and resource scarcity at this moment. With that being said, there's certainly a lot to cover in terms of what is going on with the virus and the government's response to it, but we wanted to begin by talking about other developments as they've occurred since the last time that we were all together. Lots of folks dropped out since the last time that we met together. So we've seen a number of, for example, high-profile dropouts: Elizabeth Warren, Mike Bloomberg, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Tom Steyer, all exited the race since the last time that we were together. I'd like to pause for a moment and just talk briefly about how astounding Mike Bloomberg's candidacy was in terms of the amount of money spent. So Bloomberg, during his short time in the race, spent more than any self-funded candidate in presidential history. He far outpaced Trump, Tom Steyer, Steve Forbes, who ran as a self-funded campaign a while back. If we look at this chart here, this is research from Advertising Analytics and Edison Research, and they look at the amount of per vote spending that Bloomberg, Bloomberg spent in various states, and so it was $220 per vote in Minnesota. $180 per vote in Texas, $170 per vote in Alabama. Bloomberg was spending lots of resources on winning what amounted to pretty small percentages. Now, if he was accumulating some of these percentages, very early on in the process, then there might have been a reason for him to continue. But it became pretty clear that Biden was far outpacing in terms of delegates, that he would continue to expend lots of money and only get a small share of delegates. And even if there was a brokered convention, he likely wouldn't even be the candidate with the second most number of delegates entering that, making it very unlikely that he would win the party's nomination. So it made sense to get out, but I think that there'll be lots of research that's done kind of analyzing what his campaign did in terms of the expenditure of resources, in terms of competing in that many states without outside funding. And I think there's going to be a lot of interesting questions to examine based on his candidacy. As we think about who's going to win the Democratic primary, when we met with you last time, this is a graph from 538.com that I showed you the last time that we were together. At that time, it had the odds of Sanders winning the nomination at about 2 in 5, so about a 40% chance. That's not of winning the nomination, but winning more than half of the pledged delegates at that time. Second on that list was no one, so there was about a 25% chance that no candidate would accumulate the majority of the delegates. And then there was Biden in third with about a 1 in 5 chance of winning the majority of pledged delegates going into the convention. And how much a difference a month makes in a lot of ways. But as we think about the election, this is earlier this week. Right now, 538 says that Biden has essentially a greater than 99% chance of winning more than half of the pledged delegates during the primary process, and all other necessarily then all other options, the likelihood is less than 1%. Okay, so it says the odds of no one winning a majority of the pledged delegates is about 0.3%. The odds of Sanders winning a majority is about 0.1%. And Gabbard it has here at 0%. That's especially true now considering that she dropped out earlier today. So how did we get here? Well, it all began with Obama winning, or not Obama, with Biden winning in South Carolina, and that was the case that his campaign was making. It was difficult to at times buy that case as they were doing so poorly in places like Iowa, in New Hampshire, but they kept telling the story that we're going to get to the South, we're going to do well with voters of color in southern states, and that ended up being exactly right. The strategy of the campaign, the argument the campaign was making turned out to be exactly right. So he goes in to South Carolina, wins his first state in South Carolina, and from there on goes to rack up an impressive number of states. So there were 14 states that voted on Super Tuesday. Biden won 10 of those states. Sanders won 4. Sanders won the biggest state of the night, which was California, but didn't win it by such a margin that he accumulated enough delegates to sort of undo what Biden had done in the 10 states that he won. We saw some voting this past week. So in Illinois, and one of the things that's really noticeable since Super Tuesday is not just that Biden has been winning states, but the margin that he is winning by in these states. So, for example, in Illinois, Biden won by 23 percentage points. If we look in Florida, the win was even more decisive there. He won by almost 40 percentage points over Bernie Sanders in Florida, in part because of some comments that Bernie Sanders made about Fidel Castro in there, which was alienating to particularly Latino voters in the state of Florida. In Arizona, Biden won again by about 12 percentage points. After Super Tuesday, Bernie needed to win, if not all, almost all of the states, and to win those states by big margins. That didn't happen. Even states that Bernie was expected to win in places like Washington State, Biden ended up pulling ahead. And so it became very clear that things were not moving in Bernie's direction, and it's now difficult to imagine a mathematical situation in which he would accumulate the majority of delegates going into the convention, or even stop Joe Biden from accumulating the majority of delegates that he needs to win the party's nomination. So if we look at where the delegate math is at the moment, Biden currently has 1,180 delegates. Bernie Sanders has 884. So the lead is about 300 delegates. You have to win 1,991 delegates to win the nomination. So for Sanders to pass Biden in pledged delegates now, he'll have to win future primaries by something like 30 percentage points on average. But Sanders hasn't won a single state by anywhere near that much so far, except his home state of Vermont. So unless there's some sort of stunning and catastrophic collapse in Biden's support, this pretty clearly is not going to happen. So beyond the Democratic primary, other things happened as well. I'm going to rush through some of these things because we do have other big stuff to talk about tonight. But after the impeachment trial was over, Trump went around and fired people that he was mad at, and so he fired Gordon Sondland, who was the ambassador to the European Union, who testified during the impeachment trial. He also went around and removed Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman from his White House post because of testimony that he delivered during the impeachment trial. The firing continued when he fired his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, and replaced him with Representative Mark Meadows. He sent Mick Mulvaney to Northern Ireland to serve as a special envoy there. So it wasn't a complete dismissal in the way that we've seen other Trump firings play out, but it was pretty clear that he was being pushed out of that role. In addition to turmoil at the White House in terms of staff turnover, the Supreme Court has delayed hearing arguments in cases because of the coronavirus, and that includes 3 cases from 3 different groups seeking access to Trump's financial records. So the Supreme Court right now is delayed in hearing cases which might impact some of the conversation in the campaign if the court does end up hearing those cases later on. Okay, so that is a nice transition into how this is going to impact the 2020 election. So we've seen some states decide to postpone their primary because of guidance from state government and from the CDC and other folks who are kind of experts in that field. Louisiana, for example, postponed their primary. It was originally going to be on April 4th, and now it's going to be on June 20th. Georgia also delayed their primary election. It was going to be held on March 24th, and now it's going to be held on May 19th. You've also saw, Ohio earlier this week cancel their primary. It was kind of, I would encourage you to read about this. It's a really interesting case study in kind of separation of powers at the state level, as the courts said that the election should go on while the governor was shutting down the election. So it raises really interesting questions at the state level as to who is in charge of making those kinds of decisions. But the deadline in the DNC for states to hold a primary or caucus is June 9th. And as we see states move their primary dates in response to the coronavirus, it is likely that the DNC is going to have to grapple with rules changes. Now, if the nomination contest is not competitive, if Bernie Sanders drops out, it's likely that these changes would be fairly innocuous because these elections themselves wouldn't matter very much. However, if Bernie Sanders does stick it out and makes a push for delegates, and primaries and caucuses are getting canceled, then it could get messy going forward. I'm not saying that would change the likely outcome of the nomination contest, but it could become a nasty battle. My sense is that the Sanders campaign wouldn't let it get to that point. That it would seem like kind of dirty pool if you were to kind of use the virus in order to improve the likelihood that your campaign would be successful. And I don't get the sense that the Sanders campaign is interested in that kind of fight. So we saw that the CDC was recommending canceling all events of 50 or more until May. The administration shortly after that revised that number to 10, so that you shouldn't have gatherings of 10 or more people. This is significant as we think about elections, both in terms of voting as well as in terms of campaigning. Campaigning is an active thing. There's rallies, there's meeting with voters, things like that. And so for candidates like Sanders and Trump, who attract large crowds and use those large events to connect with potential voters, it remains to be seen how they're going to adjust to these new circumstances. Sanders has had some online rallies, and so that's one way that you can perhaps address that. But they're very different things. May not affect a candidate like Biden quite as much, because his campaign really isn't built around those kind of large scale events. In a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine, Laurie Garrett, who is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations and a Pulitzer Prize-winning science writer, wrote, the title of this article was "It's Time to Cancel the U.S. Presidential Campaign as We Know It." And let me just read a little bit of what she has to say. She says, "Let's get serious, America. It's time to ask, during a time of plague, whether and if so, in what form democracy can continue as usual. The answer is likely to be disappointing. For the first time in the country's history, the United States must contemplate canceling the Democratic and Republican national conventions and campaign rallies, and give serious consideration to arranging ways of organizing Election Day that does not require in-person voting." She continues, "Consider the apparent fallout from Super Tuesday voting on March 3rd. Democrats voted in 14 states in their presidential primaries, with some states showing record turnouts and long voting lines. California voting was especially robust. The following day, the state saw its first COVID-19 death, and Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency across California as evidence surfaced of community transmission in several counties." We're likely going to have to reconsider what election looks like in a number of places. It would be strange to me if more states in advance of November did not adopt mail-in voting. It's a pretty clear way to avoid some of the implications that we're most concerned about as a result of the virus. As the article mentions, it's possible that we wouldn't see political conventions, at least political conventions the way that they have traditionally looked. The Democratic National Convention right now is reportedly putting together contingency plans to manage a potential outbreak of the coronavirus. And Republican convention planners expressed similar sentiments to Vox.com when they said, "The convention team is closely monitoring and coordinating with key stakeholders across the administration, HHS, and CDC to obtain regular updates, and that they prioritize the health and safety of attendees and have the utmost confidence in the administration's work and preparation." So they're not saying that they're going to cancel these events, but it is certainly a distinct, if not likely, possibility. As we think about the general election, I've heard some speculation that would you cancel the election, delay the election, things like that. The day of the election is decided by federal law, and it's been fixed since 1845. And so you could change the day of the election by passing an act of Congress and having it signed by the president. However, the Constitution says that the new Congress must be sworn in on January 3rd, and the president's term must begin on January 20th. So even if you passed a law that changed the day of the election, those elections would still have to occur in order for new senators and members of Congress to be sworn in on the 3rd of January, and the new president to be inaugurated on January 20th. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room there, and I can't imagine a situation in which we would pass a constitutional amendment that would make the changes necessary to extend a president's term beyond January 20th. It's hard to imagine, for example, Democrats saying we would prefer to extend Trump's administration further down the road, and we'll make this decision at another time. That seems improbable. So, with that being said, I'm going to turn things over to Mike. Mike is going to tell us about how we can put this in historical context. What have presidents dealt with before with respect to crises, and how has that impacted elections?
We certainly are in a huge crisis right now, and the coronavirus has totally changed everything. And what we end up seeing is that leadership really does matter, not just in crisis times, but especially in times of crisis. And so, as Michael indicated, what I want to do is I want to set the historical context and look at a couple of moments in history where the nation has been in times of crisis, some political crisis, some economic crisis, and see how presidents have responded to it. In a couple of the cases, the president is running for re-election in the midst of an economic crisis. So next slide, Michael. So it's 1860. The nation is really disintegrating over the issue of slavery. You've got the hapless President James Buchanan, who had actually already removed himself from contention for 1860. So in his inaugural address for his first term, Buchanan said that he would not run for a second term. And maybe that was, he could see the handwriting on the walls in terms of that this was going to get even nastier with the conflict between the North and the South. This had been brewing for a number of years. And so he decided to say he would only serve one term. So you've got the entire survival of the United States is at risk in 1860. So it was a four-way race. You've got Abraham Lincoln, who's a small town lawyer who has served 2 terms in the House of Representatives and a few years in the Illinois legislature. And he wins the election. But many in the South viewed Lincoln's election as a huge threat. They viewed it as an act of war because they were concerned about the issue of slavery, and they were also concerned about what his election would do in terms of integration of the races, integration of blacks and whites. So before Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, 1861, 7 southern states had formally seceded from the Union. So talk about crisis. That's a huge one. And of course, the bitter and costly Civil War ensues, in which hundreds of thousands of lives are lost. And that begins just a month after Lincoln takes the oath of office. So in many ways, in this political crisis, the nation was incredibly fortunate to have Lincoln at the helm with his wisdom, his courage, and his understanding of what was at stake. Next. So 90 years later, it's October 28th, 1929, and the bottom falls out of the US stock market. Sound familiar? We're experiencing that today, aren't we? So that triggers what becomes known as the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover is president, who interestingly, in 1920, Franklin Roosevelt said, you know, Hoover is a wonder and I wish we could make him president of the United States. But that was 1920. Now, millions of people have been thrown out of work. People have lost their homes. People are struggling just to get enough food to eat. And so Hoover's running for re-election against this backdrop of the Great Depression. And it's kind of ironic that Hoover, as the man who saved Europe from starvation with his superb administrative skills after World War I, couldn't pull the United States out of the Depression. And while he took a lot of proactive steps, that probably stretched what he viewed as his constitutional constraints. He still felt he couldn't go any further constitutionally, and so he didn't take further action. And I think, you know, in times of unusual events and crises, and I'm not saying that a president should ignore the Constitution, but, you know, you look at Thomas Jefferson, who purchased Louisiana from France. There was no authority to do that. And it's, Jefferson was very much a constitutionalist, but when faced with that reality, he stretched things. So again, I'm not suggesting that we say that presidents should stretch the bounds of constitutional limits. And of course, we've seen a lot of executive overreach in the last 3 years by a president who basically believes, in his own words, that the Constitution enables him to do anything that he wants. So in the 1932 election, the voters toss out the charismatically challenged Herbert Hoover, was very dour, and they take a chance with the very amiable but very untested governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt. FDR totally swamped Hoover in both popular and electoral votes, and he ended up winning all but 6 states in the Electoral College. The 6 states were congregated around the Northeast. And Roosevelt ended up rising to the occasion, leading the nation through the Depression and through World War II. So now it's 1980. The economy is in shambles with the 1980 inflation rate of 13.5%. Gas prices have skyrocketed and there's long lines at gas stations, often with limits on how much people can buy. And to top it off, the Iranian revolutionaries seized the US embassy in Tehran and kept as hostage 52 Americans for more than a year. President Jimmy Carter is running for re-election against this backdrop. And like Hoover in 1930, Carter was sincere and honest, but he failed to rise to the occasion. And he was very intense, like Hoover. And so enter into this picture, former 2-term governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who's the embodiment of charisma and hope. And so Carter is resoundingly defeated, picking up only 6 states and the District of Columbia. So an economic crisis and a president running for re-election loses his bid for a second term. Let's move on to 1992. 10 million Americans, or 7.4%, are unemployed. Country is faced with record deficits. Poverty and welfare rolls are growing. Family incomes are losing ground to inflation. President George H.W. Bush is running for re-election. And in a very interesting 3-way debate between Bush, independent Ross Perot, and Democrat Bill Clinton, just before a very critical question comes from the audience, Bush stands up, holds out his arm, and looks at his wristwatch, signaling to people that, he'd really rather be somewhere else. And so the question, go to the next slide, the question from this member of the audience is, how is the national debt, and what she really means is more the recession, but how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives, personally affected? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them? So Bush gets up and, gives a somewhat rambling and very insensitive response to the question. And it's very revealing about Bush. Some of the lines from this interchange, and it was much longer than what I'm going to share with you right now, is, and if we were doing this live and in person, I'd actually show you the video, but I thought that might be testing our technological skills tonight. So Bush says in response to this question, well, I'm sure it has. I love my grandchildren. I'm not sure I get, help me with the question. And so the questioner kind of repeats it. Well, I've had friends who've been laid off from their jobs. And the moderator clarifies that she thinks the questioner means the recession, not the deficit. And so Bush says, well, listen, you ought to be in the White House for a day and hear what I hear. I was in an AME church and I read the bulletin about teenage pregnancies, about the difficulties people are having making ends meet. He doesn't answer the question. And at one point he also says, well, if you're saying that people of means can't sympathize with people who have needs, and that's wrong. So he's very, very defensive. So Bush's turn is up, and it goes to Bill Clinton. Clinton stands up and goes to the person who's asking the question and says, tell me again how it's affected you. And so Clinton is the embodiment of charisma, of compassion, and Bush really lost his moment in this time of crisis to be able to assure the nation that he understood. Next slide. So the political crisis of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was right for the moment, and we didn't know that. He was an unknown, but he rose to the occasion on that. The economic crises of 1932 with Hoover running for re-election, 1980 with Carter running for re-election, and of course Carter had the Iranian hostage situation, and Bush with economic issues in 1992, they kind of demonstrated they were not up for the crisis. They were viewed as insensitive, and they didn't take adequate action to really make a difference. And they were all, in some ways, charismatically challenged, especially when you see Hoover up against Franklin Roosevelt, Carter against Ronald Reagan, and Bush against Bill Clinton. So FDR, Reagan, and Clinton all recognized as very charismatic individuals who were able to assure the nation in the midst of the crisis that they could handle it. So we're in this crisis right now with the coronavirus. And Michael's going to provide us with some background and analysis on some of the technical failures of the federal government and of the administration in responding to the crisis. Michael?
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so I want to talk briefly about the corona response, and not to provide a detailed sort of scientific analysis of what's happening and what should happen, but more to think about this as situated within the history that Mike was just presenting. So Mike was talking about past crises and how we think of how presidents and administrations have responded to those crises. I want to situate Trump's response to the coronavirus in that history a bit. And so thinking about the sort of technical aspects of the administration's response so far, one of the big failures of the U.S. response so far has been with respect to testing. We're, by some metrics, doing pretty poorly in relation to the rest of the world, and so we have 23 tests per million people right now. That is, if you compare that to South Korea, 3,692 tests per million people. That this is a significant failing. The lack of readiness with respect to testing when the virus came to the United States is going to be one of the things that we'll talk about in the aftermath as something that we could have done, some steps that we could have taken in order to prevent things from getting as bad as they have, and perhaps as bad as they will. Not all of this is necessarily the Trump administration's fault. When the CDC rolled out its tests, a component in them turned out to be faulty. That was unfortunate, but it then put a spotlight on the CDC's earlier decision to use its own test kit instead of the test kits that were being offered by the World Health Organization and were being used in other parts of the world. We also saw Trump's address to the nation on March 11th. Inside the White House, aides and advisors have acknowledged, according to this Washington Post article, that Trump failed to accomplish the primary goal of his speech, which was reassuring the nation, and they described it as disappointing and far from his best performance. That's language used in the article. There were some noticeable errors in the speech that was delivered to the nation. One, he said the travel ban would apply to cargo. It did not. Second, he said that health insurance companies would waive co-payments for coronavirus testing and treatment. Industry officials later clarified that it did not apply to treatments. And so they were waiving the copay with respect to testing, but not waiving the copay with respect to treatment of the virus if folks ended up testing positive. Third, he didn't fully explain the details of his travel restrictions, leaving out the fact that U.S. citizens would be exempt. So you had some American citizens in other parts of the world who thought that they had to get home really quickly because they weren't going to be able to travel back home to the United States in short order. And so it ended up creating lots of chaos and confusion, and that certainly was problematic. Likewise, folks have looked to the dismantling of the National Security Council's pandemic unit. Let me just read you a quick snippet of this AP article. It says, public health and national security experts shake their heads when President Donald Trump says the coronavirus came out of nowhere and blindsided the world. They've been warning about the next pandemic for years and criticized the Trump administration's decision in 2018 to dismantle a national security directorate at the White House charged with preparing for when, not if, another pandemic would hit the nation. It would be nice if the office was still there, says Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institute of Health. He told Congress that I would not necessarily characterize it as a mistake to eliminate the unit. I would say we worked very well with that office. And so many are saying that this is indicative of the administration not taking the preventative steps necessary to put us in a better position when a pandemic hit. likewise, the Trump administration has been unclear about how citizens should understand this crisis, understand the virus. In a time of great uncertainty, we look to our leaders for guidance to help us see past the misinformation and disinformation. And unfortunately, during this crisis, it is those very leaders who have been the ones who have been propagating that bad information. And so Trump has said it's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear. He said anyone who wants a test can get one, and we know that that is not the case. He has said now they have it. They have studied it. They know very much. In fact, we're very close to a vaccine. He has said the U.S. was the most prepared country in the world by metrics which are not clear. And so, and there's even, today he kind of said that the administration has done an excellent job and was very prepared, but it's the media's fault that things are as bad as they are. And so this effort to downplay the virus because it might make the administration look bad, I think is going to be perhaps the sort of signature failing of this administration. It literally is putting people's lives at risk. You had folks on Fox News sort of saying that this was an attempt to undermine the Trump presidency, that it was a hoax. It was another attempt to essentially impeach the president. This disinformation, the administration has a responsibility in those moments to provide clarity to people so that they know how to respond. That clarity simply wasn't there. I'm going to turn things over to Mike now because this is the technical part of an administration's response. But there's also this component of moral leadership in the time of crises, and Mike is going to touch on what that is and what that means.
Thank you, Michael. So yeah, we want to talk about the role of moral leadership in times of crisis. So I think what ends up happening is the nation, and we can go to the next slide, the nation turns to the president in times of crisis to be the comforter in chief, whether that's war, violence, terrorism, national catastrophes, pandemics, economic problems. And so the role of the president is to unify the nation, to console the victims, to bring hope, but also to administer the reins of government competently. And Michael has covered what some of the downfalls have been of the Trump administration response to the coronavirus. So I want to take a look at a couple of examples of presidential moral leadership. How have some presidents responded in times of crises, and what have been their words? And I think we can see some themes in there that they understand that the president certainly has a number of technical job responsibilities, but they're there to really provide this moral leadership, this encouragement to the nation. So we go on to the next one. So 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, a very sober Abraham Lincoln visited the site of the carnage to dedicate a cemetery to the fallen Union soldiers. His speech, the Gettysburg Address, very eloquent, only 272 words, and the president honored the brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, and connected it with his resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, but that the nation would experience a new birth of freedom. His message talked about the need to bind up the nation's wounds. And so a president in a situation like that could take the high road, as Lincoln did, or they could say, oh, the South is really bad, and but Lincoln took the high road. So he was realistic. He was empathetic. He was visionary. Next. So almost a quarter of a century later, we had the soothing and comforting words of Ronald Reagan that entered into the nation's living rooms one night in 1986 in a televised address from the Oval Office about the loss of 7 lives in the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle. Reagan said that he was, quote, pained to the core by the tragedy. And he went on that we mourn their loss as a nation together. And he spoke to families of the 7, noting that we feel the loss and we're thinking about you very much. So here's this comforter in chief, this moral leadership saying, you know, this is a bad situation and we really empathize with you. And he's not placing blame anywhere. He's trying to bind up the nation's collective wounds. Next. In 1999, you had President Bill Clinton visiting Oklahoma after it was ravaged by more than 70 tornadoes in 1 week. Clinton said, "Our hearts go out to those who have lost so much, and obviously, especially to the families of those who lost their lives." And here's Clinton, you know, with the people, comforting people. Next. September 11th, 2001, it fell to George W. Bush to express empathy and bring healing to a nation shattered by the terrorist attacks. He said, "Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened." Next. After Hurricane Sandy ravaged New Jersey in 2012, Barack Obama was there, telling the residents that, quote, "We need to make sure that everybody who has lost a loved one knows they're in our thoughts and prayers, and I speak for the whole country." And here's Obama visibly demonstrating that empathy, being the comforter. Next. February 28th, 2020, in a rally in South Carolina, Trump says the coronavirus is a hoax. And he later tried to explain that what he meant, it was a hoax that the administration wasn't getting credit for its response to the coronavirus, which when you listen to it, that's probably really true. But I mean, his words were a little bit rambling too. He also boasted at that rally that so far we've lost nobody to the coronavirus in the United States. Nobody, we've lost nobody. You wonder if the press is in hysteria mode. March 13th, when questioned about the administration's inability to test Americans for the coronavirus, Trump said, "I don't take responsibility at all." And then he went on to blame President Obama. So unlike previous presidents from both parties, Trump is in a world of his own, and he appears genetically incapable of expressing genuine empathy. And there's other examples, Hurricane Harvey and other things that have come up too. So he puts a shallow, optimistic marketing spin on everything, almost as if he's afraid of facing real pain, real facts, and troubling circumstances. So in my view, his words really fail to measure up to those of his predecessors. He somehow missed the memo that the president is called to be the nation's pastor, not just its executive, and he's to serve as the comforter in chief. Next. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about conspiracies and speculation and what could go wrong. So I want to think, you know, and some of these may seem far-fetched, but in the day and age in which we live, you know, anything could happen, quite frankly. So we want to think about the capacity of the government to deliver services and to have testing. I mean, basically, we're looking at potentially the very survivability of the government. So a couple of scenarios we want to think about. What happens if the president becomes incapacitated physically or mentally? He gets the coronavirus. So we do have the 25th Amendment to the Constitution that enables the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare that the president is incapacitated, no longer able to serve as president. We could have the president die in office. Think about it. You've got a president who, if you looked at the speech that Michael was talking about that he gave from the Oval Office, he didn't look good. It wasn't one of his better speeches. He was slurring words. This is high stress. He is obese by technical standards. He refuses to disclose his health records, and he hasn't done his annual physical, saying he doesn't have time to do it, but he has found the time to play golf. He could, so he could die in office. He could resign. So let's think about this. That, you know, maybe he sees the handwriting on the walls, that the economy is tanking, it's in shatters, the coronavirus continues to spread, it's a botched response by the government, we move into a full-blown recession or depression, and Trump is worried about his legacy, and he says, you know, better to get out of it now than to continue in office. And there's also a sense of, you know, the coronavirus is unlike any challenge Trump has ever faced before, where he can browbeat people by tweets. And that's not the ability, he can't do that with a virus that is invisible. So he may be feeling that his charade is about ready to be exposed, and so he could resign. I don't think it's likely, but you know, it is a theoretical possibility at least. Next slide. So again, thinking about the very survivability of government, let's just think about the White House staff. They go into self-quarantines, some of them, after they've been in contact with those who have the virus. What if there are deaths from the virus? So this is very disruptive. What if people start working from home? How does that work with security for computer systems? Next. So a bigger question is really the survivability of Congress. Again, similar situations, quarantines, deaths from coronavirus, and they're unable to get a quorum either because of deaths or because members of Congress say, I don't want to gather with my closest 435 members of the House or 100 members of the Senate because of the risk involved there. And there's already been discussion of this in Congress of how to make this work. But if they're not able to get a quorum, what happens if a House member dies from the virus, or many do? Well, the process is a lengthy one in terms of having to have an election for someone who's died. But if someone is incapacitated for a long period of time, there's no process, just like there is a process for the president if they're incapacitated with the 25th Amendment. So again, congressmen, senators may fear getting the virus if they meet. They work from home. You've got similar concerns about security of computer systems. Next. So let's talk about a couple of scenarios. So Trump has interestingly appointed Vice President Pence to lead up the government's response to the coronavirus. And I don't know what went through Trump's mind in making that decision, But was part of it perhaps that if this goes south on the country and the president, and the virus continues to expand and there's lots of deaths, that Trump can scapegoat Pence and say it's his fault? I mean, Trump is known for doing this with people because Trump basically says he is never at fault for anything, just like he said he takes no responsibility for the lack of testing. So might Trump dump Pence? There was one author who in an article said that he speculated that on the night in which the Democratic nominee, who looks like it's going to be Joe Biden, gives his acceptance speech at the Democratic convention, Trump is going to announce that Pence is not going to be his vice president, and he's going to select Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor, former UN ambassador, to be his running mate. Trump wants to garner the headlines, and so this would be a way to do that. So at the very beginning of our time together tonight, I showed you the dates for the fall debates, the 3 presidential and 1 vice presidential debate. And there is a likelihood that Trump might refuse to debate in the fall. He's actually talked about it, and he's complained how the debate commission is so unfair. And so Trump is going to look at the debates and say, is this to his advantage or disadvantage? If it is to his disadvantage, he is not going to debate. So, I mean, put the dates on your calendar, but don't hold your breath that it's really going to happen. So another possibility is that Bernie Sanders stays in the race through the convention, and that significantly weakens the Democratic ticket. You know, I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of signs that Sanders sees the handwriting on the wall with the delegate numbers, and he can't pass up Biden. Unless, of course, Biden has a very serious health issue. So Biden is 77 years old, and you know, actually all of our major candidates are older. So Trump is 73, he'll be 74 in June. Biden is 77, Sanders is 78. And certain things happen when you get older. You know, actually, I think all of the candidates should be tested for coronavirus. Trump says he has been tested and it came out negative. And I really think it's critical, especially since we have older candidates. So let's say it's Biden against Trump in the fall. They need to disclose full medical records, more than a letter that is dictated for your doctor to make public. They need to disclose things including their cholesterol, results of blood tests, their blood pressure, medications they're on, and their PSA, which is called prostate-specific antigen. It's the test that shows the presence of prostate cancer. And most men, when they get to that age, their PSA score starts to go up. And so in full disclosure, all the candidates should really be disclosing this information. So, you know, another what if, you know, we're in the midst of this crisis where everything is shut down right now. And what if there's an attack on the power grid or the internet? And we're relying on the internet more and more now for doing online ordering. And so that we don't have to go to grocery stores and things like that. So these are some possible things that could happen. We hope that they don't. We hope that there is continuity of government, in fact, but we live in a very unstable time, and the coronavirus is really shaking the foundations of our nation and of our democracy right now. Next slide. So we're at the end of our presentation. We're going to go ahead and take questions, but So I'm going to turn it over to Sam to explain once again how the questions are going to work, and then Michael and I will field those questions.
So thank you, much appreciated. So for the question segment, again, if you'd like to raise your hand down at your participation tab, you can select the hand raise option, or if you'd like to, you can also write in the chat. If both options are foreign to you, which I understand this is brand new to everyone, please do feel free to email that studentalumni@pugetsound.edu, and I'll also be checking those for additional questions. Once I see that someone has a question, I will unmute you, allow you to ask your question, and then we'll move on from there.
No questions, just kind of shell-shocked, huh? We'll give you a couple of minutes.
Okay, there we go. We got our first
technology here
from the Tomlin family.
Yes, we're very curious about the pragmatics of running an election, whether this is the primaries or even the general election in the presence of a coronavirus outbreak, given the turmoil that Ohio went through recently, with some contention up to the very last minute about whether the election would take place or not. I think we here in Washington State are somewhat benumbed to the difficulties or challenges that other states will have due to the prevalence of mail-in voting here. This has almost become old hat now. We've done it a couple of times, but not everywhere is that familiar with mail-in voting. How do you see that possibly playing out or even affecting both the primary campaign and the general election itself?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that this is going to be a new paradigm for us. No large mass gatherings of people, and so candidates are going to have to adapt in terms of how they campaign. I think there's going to be much more reliance on advertising, both on traditional media and social media, to get the message out. But one of the risks that this poses for candidates is when you bring all the people together, you get some energy levels, and that helps to motivate people to get out and actually vote. And then, as you indicate in your question, the actual challenges of voting are going to be very difficult if it has to be live in-person voting. And there's going to be, I would suspect there is massive interest in this election, and people want to vote. So it's a real conundrum, I think. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, so certainly there's no guarantee that we'll still be facing the same restrictions in the fall. But let's say hypothetically we are, and that a lot of states move to mail-in voting. I think there's a lot of questions about what that means. Does that change what turnout looks like in these states? So would the results be the same? It's also it would certainly change what election night looked like. Mail-in ballots don't all happen on the day of the election, and so they kind of roll in. And so you might not have results for the election on the same day that the election takes place. And so, that would be a different look and feel. I think that there's a lot of really interesting kind of logistical questions that surround this. Hopefully, we don't have to deal with any of those, but certainly campaigning itself is going to look very, very different. And it's going to be a unique election in that it's going to be occurring in the context of this big disaster, this big pandemic. And so the candidates are going to be tested and pushed with respect to how they would respond to this. The Trump administration will be evaluated on its response, and the Biden campaign will be attempting to demonstrate what a Biden administration would look like in the context of this crisis. So you see them already putting out plans and talking about what they would be doing differently.
And I think there's the context of not just the coronavirus, assuming that it is still around come the fall and come elections, but and if it is, then I think it's fair to say the economy will not have recovered. And so if we're seeing huge spikes just within the last week of the number of unemployment claims that are being filed, again, you've got lots of businesses being shut down, people told they can't work, people in the gig economy, a lot of people are being hurt there. And so we may, if coronavirus is still around in the fall and election, that means we're going to be in even more serious economic turmoil in the fall. And that's going to play in on how candidates try to position themselves. And it's also going to play into what the voters end up thinking about the candidates.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Julie, class of 1986, if you don't mind just repeating your question, I'll unmute you now.
Audio test.
You're
Yep.
alive.
We hear you.
Thank you. I minored in religion at University of Puget Sound. And for the last couple of weeks, I keep telling myself, when I get a little bit dark, this is in God's hands. But I'm just curious, any thoughts on religion in this moment in time, particularly because worship services aren't being held in person, and that's a real key part for a lot of religious communities and followers.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a real test for the religious community because, as you mentioned, no in-person worship services. Church I attend, we did a Zoom worship service using the same technology that we're using tonight. It went well, but it didn't have quite the same feel. I don't know, what the impact is going to be. I would hope that people would, as sometimes happens in times of crisis, that people often look to their faith as a means to put things in context, and that this might be something that the church as a whole does, and there may be others who are very interested in it, but it becomes a real challenge, because of the lack of meeting together. So I think there's going to have to be creative ways to deal with things, creative ways to encourage one another. There's a good friend that I have, and we've been meeting for lunch together every month for over 20 years. And this Wednesday was our appointment to get together. Well, restaurants are shut down, so we had a FaceTime chat. And so we were able to stay in contact with one another and encourage each other. So it's just going to be a different paradigm that we all have to deal with. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting to, that, it kind of brings out some of the political tensions around religion right now that, I've seen some folks react really negatively to restrictions on church attendance right now, and sort of saying that it's an example of the government sort of infringing on religious assembly, and people wanting to kind of be defiant. Let's all get together and do it anyway because it's an important part of our faith. And so I think you've seen that sort of that sort of strain of Christianity respond in that way. And I think you've seen others respond, in the same way that your church did and my church did, by holding online sessions and kind of thinking of this as being good neighbors, essentially, and what that looks like, being good members of your community, not wanting to gather because it's not just about yourself, but it's about the impact of getting together and spreading a virus, both in church and outside of those locations as well. But I think you're seeing some of the political tensions which exist within religious denominations now playing out in the context of the coronavirus.
Looking for another question if we have one. At this time, if you do have a question, feel free to unmute yourselves. The first one that I see that gets unmuted, I will let them continue on their question. For the rest, I will kindly mute you, take down your name, and let you answer in turn. It looks like we have another one from the Tomlin family again.
Okay.
Yeah, just quickly, Michael and Michael, how far could the president go to acquire for himself ever more powers, given the particular nature of pandemics?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is a president who has, as I mentioned earlier, not been shy about amassing power. He's declared the pandemic as a national emergency. But, I think there's also a sense in which he is very afraid of amassing or using too much power on this, because he realizes that will come back to him responsibility. A thing recently came up about the availability of test kits and other medical equipment. He basically said, it's up to the governors of the states to figure that out. So he's kind of taking a hands-off approach to some of that, because he sees that whatever he touches, if it doesn't go well, he'll get blamed and he can't tweet his way out of it. But I think that is a very real risk. And we haven't even talked in this lecture about the risk of the elections being tampered with by foreign powers in terms of disinformation campaigns or in terms of hacking of computer systems. And that's another whole thing to overlay onto an already tumultuous time.
I think that says it perfectly. I don't have anything to add to that.
Yeah.
All right. It looks like we have a question from Lori Cooper.
Hi, I'm probably the oldest participant here, but class of 75. I came in a little late, so I apologize if this was already discussed. But, Bill Maher goes on about if Trump loses, he won't leave the White House. Is that anything you guys discussed, or what's your feeling about that?
Yeah, we did not discuss it. We might have discussed it in an earlier lecture. I don't remember. It's certainly something I have thought about. It's certainly something that has come up, and that is a risk. One way to look at how that might play out, Trump says, I'm not leaving. So let's assume Biden is the nominee. Let's assume Biden wins. And Trump is controlling and preventing a public inauguration and saying, hey, I was cheated out of 2 years of my term because of the Mueller investigation and impeachment. And he's actually talked about that, and that maybe he should serve longer. And he has said that, which is kind of scary. And so that what Biden would do is he would go to the Chief Justice and ask to be sworn in as president. And then as president, give orders to the military to remove Mr. Trump from the White House. And I think the military would recognize the chain of command and the legitimacy of who was elected and who was not. I mean, it's a very scary scenario to contemplate, but it could happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that it is. My joke answer would be that Biden has already talked about wanting to sort of take him behind the bleachers or something, like fight him like he fought people in high school or something like that. So maybe that is something. Maybe you send in Biden personally to tussle with Trump a bit and to try to remove him from the White House. I think it is. I think. I personally, maybe this is just me being an optimist. I think it is unlikely that he that he would stay. He would quickly find that there is no, even as far as Republican leaders have gone to, I think, get behind Trump during the last 4 years. I think he'd be hard pressed to find anybody who would say that he should stay at that point.
He may take the cues from President John Adams, who, when he lost his re-election bid in 1800 to Thomas Jefferson on March 4th, 1801, which was Inauguration Day, at 4 o'clock in the morning, still dark outside, Adams leaves on a public coach back to Massachusetts, and he basically boycotts Jefferson's inauguration. But he didn't prevent it or anything like that. He just silently slipped out of town.
In the end, it doesn't matter if you, even if he just said, I'm not leaving the White House, you would still inaugurate the new president. And so he would slowly lose whatever levers of power that he had. He would just be an occupant who needed to be removed at some point.
Right.
All right, we have another question from Jim.
Except it's Barb.
Hi, Barb.
Hi, Barb.
And Jim's here too, though.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Jim.
Hi there.
We've all observed Trump. We couldn't avoid it, really. But what would you say is his biggest Achilles heel? I'm thinking of like during a debate or just what is his biggest Achilles heel as you see it?
During a debate.
Well, during a debate, yeah, I think it'd have to be like during a debate, because that would be a time where he would have a larger audience against his opponent. So whoever that might be.
Right. Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, which maybe isn't a good answer because it hasn't made any difference, is his inability to distinguish fact from fiction. I mean, a debate I could see playing out that, Trump's going to go on the attack against Biden. That's what he does. He's already begun that, obviously. That's what caused the impeachment. And so, I think we're going to see things very similar to what we've already seen. But his biggest Achilles heel on that, if this virus and the economy continue to be problems, perhaps that's going to be his big Achilles heel. Michael, what are your thoughts?
I think that you're right about that. I think that one of the things that Trump has had working for him is this, claiming everything's fine, I'm doing great. works when that is true for a large segment of the population. Not everybody. Certainly, groups, especially marginalized groups in our communities, have suffered during the Trump administration. But it's been a time of relative economic prosperity. Most people, wouldn't have found that their lives, were that much different on a day-to-day basis during the Trump administration than during the Obama administration. That's no longer true. People are experiencing and will experience economic hardship. People will see the impact of the pandemic. They're going to be feeling things around them not going well. And Trump going out and telling them everything is fine won't work in the same way when it just simply doesn't match up to their lived experience. And so I think the type of rhetoric that he's relied on for so long isn't going to work the same way.
I agree with that totally, Michael. And just another way to expand on that. So he's had a very strong core of base supporters over time who follow him regardless of what the facts seem to be. But if those core supporters are ones who, along with everybody else, gets hit financially and with their jobs, I think you're right, Michael, that they're going to end up saying, wait a minute, all this rah-rah about, America first and everything else doesn't match up to their reality and struggling financially. Yeah. Do we have other questions, Sam?
Not that I'm seeing. Does anyone else have a final question or two?
If you do, just unmute yourself, lower left on your screen.
You can rant at us too if you want. Tell us how wrong we are.
All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions.
If there are no other questions, we will call it a night. We plan to be back in June, and hopefully we'll be back in person, but we don't know. It could be the same virtual type of situation. So we'll keep you posted by email. I think I've got all of your email addresses, and we'll continue to keep you posted. So thank you so much. Good to be with you, if even only virtually.
Yeah, stay healthy, everyone. Thank you so much.
Yes.